And welcome to part 2 of the AP Unit 1 exam review. Okay, so let's get right to it. So we discussed in the last video at the very end that Shays' Rebellion prompts the Constitutional Convention, and you have most of these delegates here, 55 in particular, Madison, Washington, Hamilton, Franklin, Jefferson, amongst many others, who come from an elitist type background. Some of them have college education, and think about how rare that would be. Many are wealthy, have large plantations. So think about what theorists would say about democracy in this case. So some might say, oh, right off the bat, that's the elitist theory here, that you have the top 1% basically in control of the government. Nevertheless, they are concerned with what they call the excess of democracy, as demonstrated by Shays' Rebellion. Too much democracy, put it in the hands of people, there's going to be problems, which is quite ironic. So the convention had three main equality issues to wrestle with. Please know these. The first one, and you can remember these, RSV, a representation of the states. Well, we had the New Jersey plan, which called for a unicameral legislature, meaning just one house. There's not two houses, just one. Uni meaning one. And this was equal representation. So if a state had 1 million people and another state had 10,000, each gets the same number of representatives. And that tended to favor smaller states with smaller population. Whereas Virginia advocated for a bicameral, two-house legislature, and this would be population-based. Ultimately, what happens is you merge these two plans together and you get the Connecticut/Great Compromise, and you have a bicameral legislature. So you have one house being the Senate, and every state, no matter what size or how many people you have in it, that's based equally. And then you have another one being the House of Representatives, and that's based on population. I want to stress now that the House of Representatives is most responsive to the people because the people are directly electing them. If you're in the Senate, the people are not electing senators. Essentially, what's happening is the people first vote for their state legislature, and those members of the state legislature then vote for the state's senators. So it's an indirect process. And it's not until the early 1900s that people then have direct election of their senators. Because again, the founding fathers were concerned about excess of democracy. So you have a little bit of an elitist attitude going on here. And then the second main equality issue deals with slavery. How should slaves be counted in terms of representation? You have the South saying, well, they are people, even though we don't treat them as people, whereas in the North you say, well, you're not really treating them as people. The agreement, in order to have the South eventually ratify the U.S. Constitution, is that we're going to count slaves as 3/5 of a person. And then last but not least, how are we going to be deciding political voting? What are the voting requirements? And so the delegates didn't want to deal with this messy, sticky issue. So they said, you know what, we're going to leave it up to the states. So again, the three main equality issues dealt with representation of the states, slavery, and political voting. Now, the Constitution belongs to the living and not the dead. These are the famous words of Thomas Jefferson. And he's so right, because the founding fathers realized that the Constitution has to be flexible and has to be open to change over time. Although this change shouldn't be rapid, because again, it's very difficult to pass an amendment or a bill, but it should change as time changes. So for example, the one I always use is there's no law against child pornography in 1789 because they had no concept of such a sick thing. So by allowing the Constitution to be amended, by allowing bills to come forth, well then therefore you're allowing for change to come. So formal change mainly goes through, there are 4 phases that it can go through, but I'm going to go through the major 2. So phase 1 is that it is proposed, Congress proposes an amendment, and it requires a 2/3 vote called a supermajority in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And then from there, it goes on to the state legislatures. The state legislatures have to ratify it by a vote of 3/4 of the states. So if 3/4 of the states don't pass it, it's not an amendment. But if they do, then it's an amendment. That's hard to get 75% of the states on board. Also, you can have it proposed through Congress, 2/3 vote in each house, and then have what's called a state convention. Again, you need 3/4 of the state. This has only been used once, and that was only for the 21st Amendment, which eventually repealed prohibition. There are two other methods where a national convention could occur. This has never happened. Just have it in the back of your mind. But again, know the big idea that 2/3 by the Senate as well as the House of Representatives, and for the states, they need a 3/4 amount, so even larger than a supermajority. And again, the whole idea is that they couldn't, force some amendment down the states' throats. So the states are part of this change if they want to be. Again, think about how, states were paranoid at what they went through as seen by the Articles of Confederation. So under the new second constitution, they're giving the states some power, some voice. There is also an informal change that can occur with the Constitution, or not really so much the Constitution, but bills that are passed, and that's through the judicial branch. Famous case that you absolutely have to know is Marbury v. Madison. And John Marshall is a very smart guy who is on the Supreme Court, and he basically gives the Supreme Court this power that it's not even granted in the Constitution. It just gives itself the power, and that is the power to declare a law unconstitutional. That's a big power. They never had that power before. Certainly they could regulate disputes between states, but never to declare laws or acts of Congress unconstitutional. And that is a major power that increases the strength of the national government. So that's an informal way that the judicial branch can influence the Constitution. And there is the formal process, which requires 3/4 of the legislatures of the states and then 2/3 of Congress. Okay, other issues dealt with in the Constitution. Well, the national government can now tax. Yay! Under Articles of Confederation, they could not. Now in the Constitution, they can tax, they can pay debts, they can borrow money, they can coin money. States are now prohibited from issuing their own paper currency. They can't tax imports. They can't, for example, sign a treaty with another country. Believe it or not, that almost happened with Virginia. So that's a good thing. And then there's also things specified like individual rights. So it specifically states in the U.S. Constitution, no bills of attainder. So you're entitled to due process. You're entitled to a trial. You cannot be denied that. Ex post facto laws. They can't pass a law after you committed an act. So if they just said riding your bike down the street is illegal and we passed that today and you rode your bike yesterday, we can't say, well, we passed the law today and we're going to arrest you for yesterday's action. Not allowed. No religious qualifications to hold office, so you have a little bit of separation of church and state. And then you also at the same time have some rights not actually specified, and this is before the Bill of Rights. You don't have some rights specified, one of which would be freedom of speech and expression. So before the Constitution is ratified, the states are going to be like, well, there's no guarantee of freedom of speech from the national government. And that's why they'll eventually put in the Bill of Rights. Okay, moving on. So a lot of our national government is based around the Madisonian model. You can remember this as SLEC, S-L-E-C. So you have separating the powers over three branches, limiting majority control so not one branch can become too dominant, and that's via checks and balances. So for example, it limits the president from doing certain actions as well as the judicial branch and Congress. So it's like you have this little triangle where you're constantly preventing one branch from becoming too dominant. So if the president does something unconstitutional, Congress can then impeach that president. Then, of course, you have the federal system where power is shared between the national and the state government. And again, I mean, everything here, separating powers, limiting majority control, checks and balances, federal system, you're spreading out the power. You're putting in a number of checks to prevent tyranny from occurring. You're preventing another situation like you had with Great Britain. So you're preventing one person or one branch from becoming too dominant. Or in one case, just having the federal system, you're preventing the national government from becoming too dominant. So we drafted the Constitution. Now we have to have states ratify it, so making it official. So the Federalist Papers are going to be written, and the principal writer of this is going to be James Madison, along with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay. But know these two Federalist Papers, in particular Federalist Paper number 10, where Madison is warning against factions. He thought factions were dangerous, but unfortunately they're inevitable, he says, because of human nature. They're the result of unequal distribution. And he says, well, we can put these factions, we can manage factions here. And he states that the separation of powers, as well as federalism, can check the growth of tyranny. And he says it works better in a larger republic. You have more diverse interests, and that pretty much filters out the extremists. He also goes on to say that each branch will keep the other two in check. And he's also arguing that the Constitution guards against the dangers of direct democracy. So, you don't have a democracy of excess. So you can keep everyone not necessarily in line. You're allowing people to have liberty, but not to the point that it borders anarchy. Again, what a lot of the founding fathers feared. So definitely know those main points of Federalist Paper number 10. And then going on with Federalist Paper number 51, also written by Madison, he advocates why a strong government is needed. He famously quotes, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." And that's very true. If men were angels, you would not need a police department. You would not need a government in power. So he's advocating for a stronger government. And he says at the same time, you'll have the separation of powers, protecting minority rights. And he even states that the legislative branch, which he calls the most powerful branch, there's going to be checks on that as well, because you're dividing the legislature into two houses, one being the Senate, the other one being the House of Representatives. You're going to limit their connections to each other. So, for example, the Senate is the only house in Congress that can ratify treaties or confirm presidential appointments, whereas the House of Representatives is the only house that can introduce tax bills, for example, or appropriations. So each has their own realm. And again, these are going to prevent one house from encroaching upon the other. And then just as a sidebar, another important Federalist Paper is number 78, and that just basically spells out the role of the judicial branch, why it's needed. And he goes on to say that the judicial branch is not a threat because it does not affect the purse, meaning you can't tax the citizens, and it can't declare war at the same time. So it doesn't have power over the sword. Is the separation of powers relevant today because the executive branch is the strongest branch of the three? You can point to some things that say not so much, like the War Power Act, which stemmed out of the Vietnam War, which we debated, which basically said the president has to consult Congress on war, and the president can send in troops, but after 30 to 60 days, after a certain amount of time, the president has to pull those troops out if Congress does not declare war. Presidents hate this piece of legislation because it says it encroaches upon their power as commander-in-chief of the Army and the Navy. Again, that can be very much debated. But even though we have the Federalist Papers and they're advocating for all these great reasons as to why everything should be why the Constitution should be ratified, people still need more assurances, and that ultimately will come in the form of the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights, of course, as you know, are the first 10 amendments of the U.S. Constitution. Please know these 10. And in particular, you have the First Amendment guaranteeing religion, speech, press, assembly, as well as the right to petition government. Second one dealing with the right to bear arms. The third one, not so relevant, but troops may not be quartered in homes. That dealing with the Quartering Act during the Revolutionary War or right before it. Fourth one, no unreasonable searches or seizures. I cannot go into your house, or the police cannot go into your house without a warrant. Amendment number 5, okay, no double jeopardy. You can't be tried for the same crime twice. You can't be forced to testify against yourself. You have the right to remain silent. You're entitled to due process, meaning that you're entitled to a trial. You're entitled to all of these things. You cannot be deprived of life, liberty, or property. You need to have due process. Amendment 6, you have the right to a speedy and public trial, one being impartial. You have the right to counsel, as well as to cross-examine witnesses. Amendment 7 deals with civil cases, so civil cases have to exceed $20. Amendment number 8, no excessive bail or fines, no cruel and unusual punishment, so the death penalty would fall under Amendment 8, depending on where you stand with that. And then Amendment 9 deals with, even though some rights may be unlisted, that does not mean that they are denied. So if some right is not specified that we haven't thought of, it doesn't mean that it's denied to the people. So that's just further assurances to the people. And then Amendment 10, that powers not delegated to the United States or denied to the states are reserved to the states. So if the power is not given to the national government, it is automatically reserved for the states. And those are reserved powers. And then last but not least, you have the major differences between anti-federalists and federalists. Federalists want a national, strong government. They're advocating for the Constitution. They are more for longer terms, government by the elite. They tend to be large landowners. whereas anti-federalists tend to be small farmers, shopkeepers, laborers, and want a weaker national government.